good morning to all. And so I want to start by thanking the organizers, Miguel and Ariane. Uh, Perhaps more than in other events, I mean, this Words is such a relevant event, and so with topics very close to my academic heart. So thank you very much. And so before going into deep on each of the points that I want to cover, I want to provide a broad overview. I'm going to talk about the antitrust law topic. So I'm Francisco Beneke. I'm based in the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition in Munich, and I originally come from El Salvador. So first, I want to start my presentation with a quote from the speech of Senator John Sherman, the sponsor of the antitrust bill that was introduced in the United States Senate and later passed in 1890. And it goes like this. If the concentrated powers of business combinations are entrusted to a single man, it is a kingly prerogative, inconsistent with our form of government, and should be subject to the strong resistance of the state and national authorities. If we will not endure a king as a political power, we should not endure a king over the production, transportation, and sale of any of the necessaries of life. End of quote. So the quote captures very well the spirit with which the Sherman Act was passed. And it was not purported to achieve the promotion of business and trade, but to protect political and economic values that the senator saw very much intertwined. In the present day, this spirit has disappeared from the case law, although not from scholarship. And competition law was spread around the world from the United States to starting with Europe and then now close to 200 jurisdictions around the world. So there are some parallels in this story, but some important differences because of the different political, social, and economic contexts in which the competition laws were embedded. So I want to give you a broad framing on what is the prevailing paradigm of what are the goals of competition law nowadays. So competition law is currently aimed at preventing and correcting harm that arises from the acquisition and the exercise of market power. And this is the goal currently embedded in the laws and pursued by competition authorities around the world, if not all, but most. And this is not an accident. There is growing literature on the efforts of the US and the European Union to export a particular vision on what the goal of competition law is. With mixed results, there are notable exceptions. For example, in South Africa, the competition law aims to protect not only competition, but also the inclusion of historically disadvantaged people, so mainly people that were discriminated during the apartheid and after the apartheid period. So coming back to the concept of market power, which is the foundation of the mainstream analytical framework of antitrust law. So in market power is the ability of companies to charge prices above the marginal cost in the long term, so high prices for short. In theory, this also includes the analysis of quality, but decades of litigation and practice have shown how difficult it is to quantitatively assess the effects of quality in antitrust litigation. And the narrative is also that antitrust law is a tool to promote innovation. But again, the analysis or the direct quantitative effect of an innovation analysis is so complex that usually antitrust decisions leave it out or just pay lip service to innovation effects. There are notable exceptions. In the EU, for example, we have the Bayer-Monsanto Dow-DuPont mergers, where the decision of the Commission to order divestitures was based heavily on predicted innovation effects in agricultural input markets. So rumor has it the Commission ran into so much practical problems that they are unlikely to repeat this in the future, but I guess this remains to be seen. So now, two introductory points more directly related to the themes of this conference. So first, there are two strands of the antitrust law literature on how dominant firms, so firms with substantial market power, interact with the political process and the policymaking process. First, through investments in political connections. be it campaign donations, lobbying, hiring politicians as executives, board members, etc., with the purpose of influencing policy to entrench their market power. And two, what are the effects of dominance and the abuse of dominance in markets that are essential to the democratic process, such as news and media. So my work focuses on the first of these trends, that is, the investments that firms undertake in political connections in order to influence policy to close markets and entrench their market power. And the second, final introductory point related directly to the theme of this conference is that for roughly a decade now, there is growing research on how antitrust law enforcement can contribute to the solution of the problems caused by climate change. So one question is whether antitrust law can be applied to dominant firm conduct that harms the environment. And another question is how to weed out good collaboration from bad collaboration, because now it's commonplace that companies and industries join to try to come up with standards, environmental standards, to improve their footprint. And there are always antitrust risks related to cooperation between companies, especially between competitors. So academics, policymakers, and practitioners work on ways to ensure that competition law does not discourage beneficial forms of cooperation. So to my knowledge, there are no works in antitrust scholarship that links these two types of harms coming from dominant firms or oligopolies. On the one hand, the political influence of dominant firms in the political process to obtain policies that close markets, and on the other hand, harm from dominant firms to the environment. So I have for some months now started to work on that problem, but more on this later. So now that we have an overview, I want to go into more depth on each of these points. So let's start with the historical evolution of the purpose of antitrust law, which in the beginning was conceived as a political economy tool, enforce antitrust law so that as a way to curb the influence that corporations had in the federal government. So as I said, Senator Sherman in his speech made it clear that this was the spirit of the law, but this was picked up throughout various milestones of antitrust law history in the United States. One such was the Standard Oil decision. And after the Standard Oil decision, when this company was ordered to be broken up by the United States Supreme Court, the subsequent presidential election was fought largely on the future of antitrust law and what the goals of antitrust law were going to be. Then Franklin D. Roosevelt's famous anti-monopoly speech before Congress in 1938 and the foreign policy of the United States post-World War II to decartelize the economy of the defeated powers as a way to ensure their vision of the post-war economic and political order. So until the 1980s, so how did this translate in legal practice, in the law enforcement? Until the 1980s, the case law in the United States also included explicit reference to this goal of ensuring a pluralistic economy in order to protect a pluralistic form of government. This was mentioned explicitly in the case law, and it markedly influenced the outcomes. So in Brown Shoe, a merger case decided in 1962, the U.S. Supreme Court stated that they were upholding the effort of the Department of Justice to block the merger because they were striking a balance in favor of an economy of small and medium corporations that was compatible with the democratic system of government, even if this is meant, even if this was going to cause higher consumer prices, which today would be an impossible result, since antitrust law today privileges the analysis of prices, impact of prices, of conduct and market structure. And a year later, in a merger case decided again by the Supreme Court in the banking industry, The court expressed deep concern regarding concentration levels, so 30% of the market that would have not raised alarm by any benchmark nowadays, with the same rationale of the need to maintain a pluralistic economy at the federal level to maintain an independent state. We can find similar reasonings also in monopolization cases, roughly abuse of dominance in the European Union, where the strategy of Aluminum Corporation of America in the 1950s was punished as anti-competitive, the strategy of building surplus capacity. So this would have never been considered anti-competitive nowadays because firm size is less important than cost reductions that can be brought about by economies of scale. On the European side, in Europe, ordoliberalism is credited as a school of thought that influenced the amendments and the enactment of new competition laws after World War II. And ordoliberalism was a school of thought that emerged as a fusion of ideas of several neoliberal schools throughout Europe. In Germany, the Freiburg School. And in the Freiburg School was deeply concerned about the harms that large corporations could pose to democracy. So one of the main considerations of the members of the school of thought was the idea of a strong state independent of the influence of large corporations. So this ideal was based on what they had seen in the past. So what they saw in the Weimar Republic period was that competition law and economic policy was applied to privilege and promote the growth of established national champions. So the liberal idea, maybe linking a little bit to the previous presentation, was like heavy involvement of a state to ensure a free market, freedom, or they called it freedom of enterprise to all, right? So even though political economy considerations do not appear explicitly in EU leading cases, as it is the case in US competition law, it is undeniable that some parts of EU competition law have favored this idea of maintaining a deconcentrated market structure, regardless of what this means for consumer prices. And one very clear example is the law on rebates, so discounts on quantity. So discounts on quantity are deemed to be exclusionary, so anti-competitive, even without imposing a below-cost standard. So that means the companies can be fined and enjoined from giving rebates without needing to argue that predation is taking place. So this basically means that customers of these companies are required to pay higher prices to maintain an unconcentrated industry. And outside of Europe, around the world, we can also interpret this recognition of the mutual relationship between economics and politics in antitrust law. One such example, according to Eleanor Fox, is the simultaneous transition from communism and central planning on the one hand to democracy and market economies. Competition laws were commonly a part of the economic reforms undertaken in these transitions. In my home country, in El Salvador, after the Civil War ended in 1991, in the peace agreements, one of the main demands of the left-wing party that emerged as a succession of the guerrilla that fought the war was the enactment of a competition law, because they saw a very important social function of competition law, and mainly they saw it as a rejection of the previous economic system, which can be roughly labeled as crony capitalism that had favored or supported the dictatorial regimes of the past. And we can also interpret that this mutual relationship is recognized in parts of competition policy outside of the EU competition laws, Article 101 and 102 of the treaty, for example, in state aid laws that apply to fiscal benefits to companies. And in some Latin American countries, like in Peru and Chile, The competition authorities have direct powers, which is a little bit unorthodox in competition law, direct powers to go after the regulations or policies that cause anti-competitive effects. So going back to the historical evolution in the United States, so in the background, there was some discontent brewing with this form of competition law, with these goals of competition law, of preserving a pluralistic economy that compatible with a democratic system of government. And this started with scholars at Chicago University in the 1950s. So prominently among them, Nobel laureate George Stigler. The work, oversimplifying for simplicity, was aimed at criticizing what was known as the structure conduct performance paradigm. That was the basis of the law enforcement back then, and the fear of corporate bigness that it caused, according to the Chicago scholars. So the structure conduct performance paradigm, briefly put, theorized and empirically thought to establish a relationship flowing from the structure of the market, causing how many firms can profitably operate, to their behavior, incentives to behave in an oligopolistic or monopolistic manner, to the performance of the market, usually in their studies measured with levels of price and cost. So the Chicago economists focused their work on showing how even when you have oligopolistic structures and monopolistic structures, some of the behavior that was viewed with this deep suspicion at the time could have efficiency explanations. One such area was the resale price maintenance, the law on resale price maintenance in the United States. So, for example, when a manufacturer dictates the price at which his wholesalers or retailers sell the products. In the United States, that was more or less punished, what you call a per se rule. You find the conduct, you find that the conduct has taken place. You don't have to analyze the effects of the conduct. You presume that it is harmful. So the views of the Chicago school started as fringe theories, and they were seen, as fringe scholars and in antitrust law. But their views started to take hold slowly. And when you fast forward to the 1970s, to the deep economic recessions that took place, and how the political landscape changed, political, social, and economic landscape changed, that paved the way for the rise of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher in the US and in the UK. The Chicago school views became mainstream knowledge in the law, and they were introduced in the law. And how were they introduced in the law? This was aided by a series of judicial and executive appointments. So it was as much a political effort as it was an intellectual effort. So in practice, the success of the Chicago School of Thought of Antitrust meant that political economy considerations all but disappeared from the law. The Chicago School of Thought, its ideas on what the goals of antitrust law were and and which practices were to be presumed to be particularly harmful, were exported to the European Union, where they were labeled as the more economic approach to antitrust law that was embraced by the European Commission in the 1990s. This made much slower inroads into the thinking of the European courts, but that still maintained good parts of the law, as explained the law on rebates, under ideas more consistent with the order liberal school of thought. But now there are some winds of change, perhaps sparked by the changes brought about by the Great Recession of the late 2000s. So the voices advocating for more vigorous antitrust law enforcement as a tool to curb the political influence of large corporations are much louder now than they were 20 years ago, when the state of consensus around the goals of antitrust law was deemed to be as strong as it ever was, at least compared to the preceding 50 years. This was famously claimed by Herbert Hovenkamp, one of the most influential antitrust scholars in the United States, and I would argue in the world. So, prominent voices of dissidents that advocate for more vigorous antitrust law enforcement include Lina Khan, the current chair of the FTC, Tim Wu, who until last year served as a special assistant to the President of the United States for technology and competition policy. And in Europe, we have Ioannis Lianos, who was head of the Greek Competition Authority until last January, and now member of the UK Competition Appeal Tribunal. So I'm leaving many influential names behind. I'm just focusing on those that have received political appointments and that can influence a change in the law. So when these dissidents began to take prominence, there was a rhetorical effort to dismiss it. And one of the labeling terms that was thrown out there was, this was called hipster antitrust. So nevertheless, these ideas have become increasingly influential in the United States and have been for some time in other parts of the world, such as South Africa. So contemporary examples of the inroads that these ideas have made into U.S. policy or U.S. political discussions or include the Better Deal, sponsored by Democrats, in which it was stated the following, and I quote, "Because concentrated market power leads to concentrated political power, large companies deploy armies of lobbyists to increase their stranglehold on Washington. Republicans on their side are also similarly concerned about the political power that the digital giants wield, mainly due to concerns on political censorship of content platforms." And then during 2020, there was a hearing at the U.S. Congress where the CEOs of Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon were called on to testify on an antitrust after the results of an antitrust investigation from Congress were published. And Representative Cicilline closed his opening statement of that hearing with the following remark. Let's see if it sounds familiar. "Our founders would not bow before a king, nor should we bow to the emperors of the online economy." End of quote. So my current work focuses on how we can include political economy considerations in the analysis of antitrust cases. So I would say my work is different from what is done in the new Brandeis school of thought in the United States right now, which tries to focus the goal of competition law in preserving the competitive process and take away a focus on outcomes. Right now, outcomes on prices. And why I think why my research is why my work or the focus of my work is different is because I think the inclusion of considerations around the harm that comes from the political influence of dominant corporations has to be done in a markedly different way from how it was done in the past. In the past, in the merger cases that I mentioned and in the monopolization case that I mentioned, it was done with a presumption. So most any conduct or most any degree of market concentration was deemed to be incompatible with the democratic system of government. So I think now this analysis should or could be done more explicitly. So political connections of firms will not be a problem in every market, right? So, and there is evidence that courts and authorities can analyze to see if it is a problem and the extent of a problem. And this comes from the extant literature on state capture and public choice theory. There's a you can use indicators on lobbying expenses or donation to political parties, how this has grown over time, and if possible estimate how this correlates with the structure of the market, which are competition law variables. So how can you, what are ways to include this type of analysis in antitrust law? So since the focus of antitrust law is market power from either monopoly or oligopolistic firms, political capture, state capture, political activists of firms is an important element to analyze how dominant firms are, so how entrenched they are in the market. In addition, so a little bit more controversially, we could explore if competition law could capture as anti-competitive behavior the actual activity of lobbying, specifically lobbying that is aimed at policies to influence the adoption of policies that close markets. Let's say if the German car manufacturers or European car manufacturers lobby so that the tariff of importation of cars is raised. So this is why I say this is more controversial, is because at least in legal terms this clashes against very important fundamental rights, even that are ascribed even to firms, to corporations. And one of them is the right to petition public authorities. And in the specific case of the US, after Citizens United, a decision by the US Supreme Court, donations to political parties are viewed as free speech. So the legislation that limits limits this has a very high standard to prove. Can be struck down very easily in practical terms. On the other hand, there are no fundamental rights or constitutional rights that are absolute. So I suggest to carve out narrow exceptions. So companies should not have unfettered rights to influence government to preserve their market power and economic profits. So critics could point out that antitrust law is not the right tool to address this problem. To police that the protection of democratic values in the political process, even if it comes from firms of market power and the activities enabled somehow by the existence of market power in the market. So this is a work in progress from my side. I haven't reached a conclusion on the desirability of using antitrust law to capture this behavior as anti-competitive, but I just I put this idea out there. So if you cannot capture lobbying as anti-competitive behavior and punish it, and enjoin and punish it with fines and enjoin it, then whatever regulation you think is better suited, let's say limits on lobbying activities or on donations to political parties, they have to explicitly take into account the competition aspect of the problem. And what I mean by explicitly taking the competition problem into account would take the form, and I throw this as more as preliminary examples of, let's say you impose limits on lobbying or donations to political parties according to market concentration thresholds. Let's say nowadays you have market concentration thresholds that more or less justify blocking a merger or imposing structural remedies. So could we do this for lobbying activity? Or if you can punish infringement to this limit by imposing structural remedies, let's say, or breaking up the companies that break these limits to address the structural problem where it comes from. Problem coming from market power leading to economic profits that are that are used to influence policy making to ultimately entrench the market power of corporations. Then moving on to explicit considerations of climate change in antitrust law. I think at the beginning I mentioned there is growing literature on how to assess harm from anti-competitive conduct that goes beyond, the variables that are analyzed in antitrust law, mostly price, but let's say also quality and innovation that ultimately has an impact on consumer welfare, as is narrowly construed in antitrust law cases. But I think part of the story, which has been largely left unexplored, goes back to the previous point I was trying to make. So if you have a relationship between market power, economic profits, and political activism, and this somehow influences environmental policy, I would say if the influence of this on policy that closes markets to entrenched market power is uncharted territory in antitrust law, at least, focusing this topic on environmental policy as outer space. I think this is pretty much out there even for people that advocate for an expansionist view of the goals of antitrust law. But because of the relationship that I explained, I think at the very least it is justified to explore the economic relations of the problem and possible legal solutions. So I've been talking very abstractly, but I can illustrate what I mean with a real-life example. So the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest has happened mostly in Brazil, on the Brazilian territory. And 90% of this land has been used for cattle, for raising cattle. And at the same time, the largest meat packing and exporting company in the world sources the meat from Brazilian cattle, is JBS. So, according to Brazilian law, you are forbidden to buy meat from cattle ranches that have illegally deforested the Amazonian rainforest. Even so, investigative journalism has found that JBS purchases significant amounts of meat that come from illegally deforested area. They pack it and they label it as compliant with the law, and law enforcement agencies not turn a blind eye, but they take advantage of a very striking loophole. They say the illegal ranches sell the meat to other ranches, intermediary ranches, and JBS purchases the meat from these intermediary ranches. So authorities in Brazil have interpreted that JBS is not required to police the source of the meat of the legal ranches. So I think, for me, that this can be a loophole is striking. And related to the points that I was trying to make, so should JBS be allowed to lobby and hinder the efforts of lawmakers and the authorities to close this loophole? So what does society lose if we curtail the ability of JBS to do this? And what does society gain? So with these questions, I want to close my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for crucial information about the development of the antitrust legislation and thinking about it. So do we have any question from the audience?
I think gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. Thierry Philippona from Finance Watch. Thank you for your very interesting and insightful presentation. On the last, I'm just going to make a suggestion. On the last topic you mentioned, the relationship between antitrust law and climate change. Very modestly, I would suggest that you investigate what's happening today in Brussels, Brussels being the center of the EU as we know, because there's a huge trend of trade bodies, in other words, business lobbyists, going against any alliance of organization working on climate change on the basis of antitrust law. And mind you, there's a number of alliances, alliances of insurers or asset managers or bankers, for net zero, blah, blah, blah. Big topic, very weak in my view, but still they exist. And even that very weak form of alliances to go in a certain direction is attacked on the basis of antitrust law, like you're coordinating your action, and therefore that's anti-competitive So you're not allowed to, for instance, let's be very concrete, to have coordinated net zero policies because that's anti-competitive. And the worst thing, and it's a winning argument. At the moment, it is winning. So antitrust law at the moment, long story short, is being used in the EU to combat any effort, as weak as it may be, because the efforts I'm mentioning, in my view, are very weak, to combat climate change. So it's something to be borne in mind, I think.
We should take a couple of more questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And then you respond.
Yes, it's more like a follow-up question because I don't know if you have heard about the case of Chicken of Tomorrow, which is judged by the Dutch Antitrust Authority in 2014. So basically, it's a group of companies, they want to increase the price in order to provide, advocate for more animal welfare. They say if we increase the price of chicken for how much, then we can give chicken like better environment and also longer time. So because you mentioned in the point that sometimes antitrust policies cannot distinguish between what is a good cooperation and what is bad cooperation. So I wonder, like, what's your point on there? Like, from what basis can we identify this good cooperation in the legal enforcement?
Yeah.
Sure, yes, immediately. Yeah, so actually I think there is a connection between what you are saying and the previous presentation. Because, I mean, corporations are very complicated. They are like the investment funds. Firms are owning firms in so many sectors, right?
Yeah.
And some of them with different interests. But then you have that through the production chain, there is this about like your shifting risks, right? Which, as you were saying in the case of Brazil, makes it very complicated. So I just wanted to reflect on that. I mean, the structure of of property becomes so complicated that it's, and particularly through the supply chain, that is very difficult to handle environmental concerns and what to do then.
So I first to address the comments on collaborations that can be, so collaborations with the aim of improving the environmental impact of the industry and how can they be captured by antitrust law. So a quick reaction to your suggestions. I think it's one of the topics that receives the most attention in the antitrust law literature nowadays, and some relevant policy developments in recent times are the horizontal cooperation guidelines from the Commission, where they attempt to establish like very, even if vague, some safe harbors on what forms of cooperation will most likely escape even the beginning of prosecution. And that point is very important because I think so. The case you mentioned in Brussels is also it's also happening in the U.S. In the beginning, Republican Congress people wanted to hold an antitrust hearing on this strategy by investment funds of demanding better standards from the industries in which they invested. But now it turned into an antitrust case. I think the Congress people, together with some state attorney generals, are starting to, they either already filed a complaint or are about to file a complaint on this issue. And I don't know the facts of the case in Brussels. In the US, I guess we'll know more as the litigation progresses. But it looks, I'll venture and say this, it looks a little bit far-fetched from an antitrust law perspective to assign liability to this in the US case. But I think only the risk of prosecution is enough to discourage. This is also the case in the Netherlands. I think is one of the cases that has sparked a lot of discussion points in in this area of cooperation, and if antitrust can be an obstacle. So I think one important takeaway there, at the time, the Dutch Competition Authority said the alliance as it is now formed is anti-competitive, and the effect on price will outweigh the effect on. They try to quantify the effect, or what is the price effect of animal welfare. I think that they try to gauge it through consumer surveys, how much they are willing to pay for a chicken that is treated better. They said, so what consumers say they're willing to pay is less than the increase in prices that the alliance will bring about. But what they just, I think, I forget the specific arrangement, but the industry standard moved forward with some modifications that appease the competition authority. I think so. This is commonly the case. So you have even if the competition authority has some issue with the cooperation, it is common that you can work it out and you don't block the functioning, or you don't substantially hamper the objectives of the cooperation. This is different, for example, like if you have an industry, let's say European supermarkets come together and say, we'll boycott, as some did at the time, will boycott meat from Brazil or from JBS. So that's I think under the current framework of antitrust law, and that's why it needs adjustments, that is clearly anti-competitive. And I think so to go forward, the supermarkets would have to modify this alliance more to make it voluntary. Let's say, instead of forbidding the purchase of meat that comes from Brazil, let's come up with a seal, and this seal says deforestation-free meat. But that goes some way, but it's clearly much less effective than a full-blown boycott. And currently, antitrust authorities don't balance or don't fully balance environmental effects against price effects. And I think that's part of the problem right now.
Thank you very much, and it was fascinating to hear how antitrust, which is supposed to safeguard the interest of against the big corporation, is being used and abused now in when trying to take initiative to tackle climate change. So thank you very much, and we have the coffee break. We're inviting you in the hall for a coffee break, and then we'll be back to listen to more to Thierry Philippona from Finance Watch. Thank you. Half an hour.